welcome to Bookends Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Story Seller in collaboration with New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. Bookends is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, April 13th at 11:30 and will feature the poet Rick Hiles and his book of poetry called My Roberto Clemente. This month, Michael Schumacher will talk about his book Dharma Lion, a biography of Allen Ginsberg and his life and times, with fascinating portraits of Jack Kerouac, Neil Cassidy, and William Burroughs. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to put them in message in chat. Like other Bookends, this program will be recorded and made available on our website, www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Now, let's welcome to Bookends Online Edition, Michael Schumacher. Welcome.
Hey, how are you? I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
We can all hear you.
Okay, good. You know, it's really funny, just the timing of this thing. Like I was telling you before when we weren't on yet, I just signed to do a book, and it's about the friendship of Kerouac and Ginsberg. And this kind of book has never really been explored before, only because there's so much material. It was amazing to me. I went back and I tried to find the books that I have that I had not used in my biography. And Bill Morgan, who also wrote a biography of Ginsberg, is also a good friend of mine. And I went through them all, and I took the books that I had not used yet, just the books that I had not used and Bill had not used. And it came to like 40 some books. And these are books that have been written since, I think the earliest one was around 2000. So obviously there's a market for this stuff. People still are interested in them. And what was kind of interesting for me is they wanted me to do a proposal and all this other stuff that you got to do. I went back and was looking at some of this stuff, and it was almost new to me. You know, I knew this stuff, but there was so much new material out there with new statements that have been delivered, new things that happen. A perfect example. Back in the late 40s, I believe it was, Neil Cassidy had sent Jack Kerouac a letter that became known as the Joan Anderson letter. And this opened up the whole game in the respect that Kerouac had been trying to write on the road and just couldn't figure out a way to do it. The Joan Anderson letter did it. The Joan Anderson letter had been unavailable except scraps. And they found the whole thing last year. They published the whole thing, or it was the year before last, whenever it was that I found it. But I'm reading through this letter, and it's like news to me. It's new stuff. And the more I study this stuff, the more I realize how everything was kind of connected in its own strange way. And we're still getting connections. There was a book that just came out called Best Minds. It was written by a guy, I think he's from the University of Chicago or Illinois Chicago Circle. And it was interesting to me because it blew everybody away that had been writing about the beats to this point, because they had in this book, and I know it's real because they have the document, Allen's agreement to have his mother lobotomized. And Allen always told everybody. He told Bill, he told me, he told everybody. It happened in the 50s. It did not. It happened in 1948, which was a incredibly important year. And you throw that in there and it changes everything. You know what I mean? So things are always changing every time you turn around. So I was talking to this publisher and he was all for it and not a problem as far as getting it done. A book that actually examines the friendship between these two men and how it affected their work, how it affected literature, how it affected everything. And so, in preparing for all of this, I'm going through this stuff all over again. And so, I had different stuff to talk about. And in this particular instance, the beginnings of the Beat Generation. How did this all start? Where did it start? Well, it started with Kerouac and with Ginsberg and with several others. Burroughs was involved in it. Cassidy was involved in it. Lucian Carr was involved in it. Most of these people I never spoke to, Jack Kerouac, and I never spoke to Neil Cassidy because I was just a teenage kid when they died. But everyone else, I think I've spoken to every other member of the Beat Generation.
Cool. Were they all friends to begin with, or how did they all meet and become this?
That's interesting by itself to me because Burroughs and Lucian Carr were from St. Louis. Allen was from New Jersey. Kerouac was from Massachusetts. But they all wound up because of Columbia University. They all wound up at Columbia University. And it's so weird. You almost don't believe it until you see it. Lucian Carr was dating this girl. Now, the girl's roommate was dating a young man named Jack Kerouac. And all of this stuff started to come together. It wasn't planned. It wasn't like this big, they try to make it sound like there was this big literary establishment or something. No, it came together. They were all interested in writing. That was the thing. Everyone was interested in the writing angle of it. So they just took off from there. And they had these big, long conversations. And two of them that I'm going to talk about here today, and I'm talking about in the new book, is there was where they were forming a whole type of language that did not like how it was being done. So they decided, well, what do we do to make it better? And they called it the New Vision. And the New Vision was just a way of telling your own story as literature. Now, cut to, I don't know what it would have been. I have to look up the actual dates. But a couple of months later, there were four of them. There was Kerouac, there was Ginsberg, there was Burroughs, and there was another guy named Hal Chase. Now, Hal Chase becomes important because who do you suppose introduced the group to Neil Cassidy? All of this stuff, it's hard. Hal Chase was a student at Columbia. Well, they were all gathered one evening, and they had what they called the Wolffian, non-Wolffian study. Who are we dealing with here? Kerouac and Chase were Wolffians. They followed Thomas Wolfe, the great writer. Ginsberg and Burroughs were the non-Wolffians. They followed European writers. Now they have this information. How do you apply that to the New Vision? So it was all kind of everything kind of. I think the Beats. In fact, I don't just think the Beats. I'm sure of it. Over the years, got the short end of the stick as far as how much work went into the creation of this kind of literature. It was different. And so everybody just assumed that it was just something that they did. But it wasn't that simple. Uh, they worked at it. And so now all of a sudden I have another book to write, and it's going to explore this even further.
So what was their vision of this new language? Like, what were they? Was there something specific that they were arguing against or trying to alter? What were they trying to accomplish?
They didn't like, as a general rule, and I'm using generalities here, but the old styles of writing, which was all right with me because I was one of those people when I was a student. I liked Hemingway. I could not stand Fitzgerald. Perfect example. Now I shouldn't say that. I'm talking to a Minnesota, but I was not a fan of Fitzgerald's. I thought Great Gatsby was way overrated. Uh, I loved Steinbeck. So some of these people, Kerouac's first book, Town and the City, could have been written by Thomas Wolfe. It was Wolfian in style, but it was beat generation and subject because Jack was writing. He had all these characters in a book, and two of them he used himself as a model. You know, and that's how it grew into this weird place. Uh, and the two most important figures in this group were Kerouac and Ginsberg, because Allen they were from completely different families, types of families. Kerouac was blue collar all the way. His father ran a printing press. His mother worked in a shoe factory. Uh, and Jack's oldest brother died very young of disease. I think it was scarlet fever, but I'm not certain of that. But Allen, meanwhile, was brought up in a white collar family. His mother, when she could, was a teacher, and she was a good teacher, but she had paranoid schizophrenia, which ended up a good portion of her adult life was spent in mental institutions. His father, Lewis, was a published poet. He had published several books. Uh, he taught school. He was a school teacher. So you had these two completely different people, Kerouac and Ginsberg, that connect. Now, how did they connect? They connected in weird ways. The first time they met, there was no secret that Allen, the thing that attracted him to Kerouac was a damn good looking man. And that mattered. Uh, I mean, I'll never forget this. I'll go to my grave remembering this. I was talking to Allen's stepmother, the person that married Allen's father later. And she was talking about the time that Jack had come over and Allen had come over. Well, Allen was there already, but Peter Orlovsky was there. And, and she's like a schoolgirl. Oh, you should have seen Jack. Oh my God. And she's going on and on. I thought this was funnier than heck, you know. But this is what attracted Allen at first. But before the first meeting was over, they realized how much similarity they had, even to the point of they would walk downstairs. They'd be leaving a building and they would say goodbye to the building through the stairs. You know, this was you couldn't make this stuff up. You know, they were so connected, Alan and Jack, and they became the real backbone of the whole, Beat generation.
Do you think that they set out trying to start a sort of
I think
movement or it just worked out that way?
they That's a tough question to answer in the respect that they wanted to change things. Don't get me wrong. They wanted different kind of literature, and they talked about that the first time they met, and then things just kept rolling. It just kept going. But that's what they wanted. They wanted to create a new kind of literature, but at the same time, it wasn't like Kerouac. He had no use for the Beat Generation. He dealt with it, and then he didn't deal with it. This is when he and Allen started to split apart. Was Allen loved it. He loved the attention. He loved being in front of you know everybody. That's who he was. Jack wasn't that way at all. Jack was a solo artist. Jack Kerouac had written 1,000,000 words before he and Allen met. I mean, he was 4 years older than Allen. I should mention that he was born in 22, Allen in 26. But he had written and written and written. That's all he did. He had pocket notebooks and big notebooks and everything you can imagine. Allen wrote, but Allen he didn't go to Columbia to be a writer. He went to Columbia to be a labor lawyer. He wanted to be, one of these people, that settle labor disputes. And Lucian Carr, his friend Lucian, looked at him and said, "What are you? You're gonna be a labor lawyer? You've never worked a day in your life. What do you know about labor?" You know, and this is kind of how it all. It started out. It was like People forget this. Allen was 17 years old when he signed on to Columbia. He was called the professor in high school. That was his nickname. Was the professor because he was so smart. Now along comes Jack Kerouac, who never spoke a word of English until he was 5 years old, because he was French Canadian originally. And he learned how to speak English. He learned how to use English. And boy, did he learn how to use English as time went on. But these people were so interesting to me. And it's hard for me to explain to people. It's hard for me to explain to people listening in, how interesting that was. I used to, and this is what I am old, but made me feel old, was I was thinking about the old days when I used to send away every month. I was sent to City Lights Books in San Francisco and order just 2 or 3 books, whatever I could afford. And they would send them back with a new slip with new book possibilities and everything. And this is how I learned about them. I learned about Ginsberg because my high school teacher was telling us what an evil poem Howl was. Well, I was living in Milwaukee at the time. I went straight downtown Milwaukee, went to the bookstore, and bought a little Pocket Poets Howl, because it was, it was forbidden. I was, and for a long time, up until just a few years ago, I taught one day a semester at one of the local high schools here. And I had a list of books that I had typed up, single space, about 2.5 pages of typed books. You should know about these books. They won't tell you they exist, but you should know they do. And they weren't all beat. Don't get me wrong. Raymond Carver, who I knew Ray real well. Ray, he certainly wasn't Beat Generation, you know. And Neely Tchaikovsky, the wonderful poet and biographer, died this week. And so there's stuff that's been written about Neely in the papers and so forth. I started thinking about one of his closest friends was Charles Bukowski. Another one of his closest friends was Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He wrote books about both of them, and there couldn't be two more unlike people than Ferlinghetti. And I mean, it's just there was room. How's that? Maybe that's the easiest answer to your question. There was room for a new group. there was room for a new voice. And these people, for whatever reason, and there were many reasons, they chose to pursue this.
Cool. So I'm trying to do the math. So this was in the early 40s that they were in
Yes,
college,
yes. They went,
and they
Allen met them in 43.
okay.
So yes.
And they didn't fight in the war or anything? None of them?
No, you know what's really interesting about that is they stayed. Lucian was the first one, but Allen got one too. Rooms that were kept by seminarians who left the rooms so soldiers could move in, people that were training. Allen and Jack Kerouac both served in the respect, they were both in the merchant marines, but they weren't they never fought, no. That would have, can you imagine Allen Ginsberg fighting? Can you imagine
Can't
Allen?
imagine either of them.
I'm not thinking so. And
Yeah.
Jack was the same way.
Yeah, because I guess I always kind of associated beat with the 50s, but it would be earlier that they met.
Well, you know what was really funny was the stuff that was written about, for example, in On the Road. That was stuff that took place in the 40s. Jack couldn't get the book published until
Hmm.
57. So there was a long period of time where everything was different. You know, it was just, they were, it's not that they weren't writing. Jesus, Jack must have written a half a dozen at least novels, more than half a dozen. You know, he just wrote and wrote and wrote. Allen didn't really start writing poetry until he was taking classes at Columbia University. He took poetry classes from some pretty well known people and started writing, but it was all very much what we were used to and rhymed, very, very well measured poetry. And so he didn't really learn how to write poetry, Allen didn't, until he met William Carlos Williams, the wonderful
Ah,
pediatrician from New Jersey. And they became friends. And Allen would send him the stuff. And it's funny because Williams wrote him back a letter, said, "Oh, with this, perfection is normal, you know, with this rhymed, you know, poetry. Do you have anything else?" So Allen went back into his journals and he took out certain selections of the journals and he rearranged the lines. He sent them to Williams, and Williams almost croaked. This is it. This is it. I'll see that you have a book. You see what I'm saying? This whole
mhm.
thing was so crazy. There's a book coming out in about, oh, I think it's about a month, about Gregory Corso, the young New York poet that became friends of all of theirs. And what this is all these people donated stories about meeting Gregory and what it was like dealing with Gregory and what he was like with Allen and what he was like with, you know, they all were so connected. That was the thing I loved. I absolutely loved about the Beast. There was never, they were all different. You know, I was a fairly decent friend of Michael McClure's, the poet. Well, he was out on the West Coast. He was a West Coast poet. He worked with animal sounds. Gary Snyder's about the only one left. He's 93, I want to say. And Gary lived in the Pacific Northwest, you know, before he moved down into the area. They all met in Frisco for the most part. First, there was the New York group. Then, because Kerouac and Ginsberg both were friends of Neil Cassidy's. Where did Neil Cassidy live? On the West Coast. You know, so they moved. And then Allen met all these people. and Jack met all these people and so forth, and more stuff got developed. Everything just kind of went its own way, but it was all argued about. Believe me, it was argued about. They went back and forth on this stuff because this wasn't stuff that people took, like for granted or anything. This was all new. And
Mhm.
Kerouac, that's what I mean. The Wolfian is not Wolfian. Kerouac was, well, this is how we do this. We live in America, blah, 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 blah. And Ginsberg or Burroughs would go, no, that's not how we do it. And they went back and forth on it. Well, what ended up happening was they all wrote their own way anyway. So it didn't matter what they thought. I just finished reading a book of Kerouac's that he wrote in high school and right out of high school. And, how much of what he had learned, he was already incorporating into his writing. Now, the thing that made the big difference in the new vision was, and then the Wolfians, now Wolfians, and then on, was what they decided was worthy of being published, and they did. I mean, they went down to Times Square and watched people like Herbert Huncke, who was a friend of all of theirs. Herbert, I knew him, but I didn't find him all that fascinating. But these guys sure as hell did. Uh, or some of the junkies. Herbert was a junkie, and he was always scamming somebody. There was always something, some game being put on, and he got to Allen in the summer of '48. I think that no. It was the winter of '49 because he came. He was, his feet were bleeding, and he'd been walking the streets. He'd been let out of jail where he'd spent some time, and Allen took him in, which is in Howell, incidentally. That a line about that is in Howell. But Hunky used Allen's apartment to store stolen goods. He and two friends. Well, Allen, as was always the case, he got caught, and that's he was. See, you see how this is all starting to fit together. Everything snaps together. It really does. Uh, Allen, to stay out of prison, went to the insane asylum. Who was in the insane asylum? Who did he meet in the insane asylum? A man, a very interesting man named Carl Solomon, who he dedicated Howell to. And they started talking. Well, Kerouac, in completely unrelated ways, he was involved in the Lucian Carr murder of David Kammerer, another St. Louis guy who had followed him all across the United States. He was stalking him, literally stalking him. And one night, Carr, they'd all been drinking. Well, Carr and Kammerer, they were just together. Pulled out a scout knife and stabbed him to death. Well, the first person he goes to, Kerouac, was, I want to say Burroughs. And Burroughs told him, turn yourself in. That's it. That's it. Turn yourself in. Then the next person that Carr goes to is Kerouac, who helps him. He threw a knife down a grate, a sewer grate, got rid of all this stuff, and so Kerouac was busted for being an accomplice. He wasn't nailed for murder or anything, but he was an accomplice. So what does Jack do? What anybody else would do? He got married, moved to Detroit, and he lived there, I think about 6 months. He wasn't there long. The marriage didn't last. But that was to stay out of jail. Because they had, this is New York. They have a few people in jail there. And so they didn't even know if they had the room for them. So they were more than happy to cut these deals with them. And what ended up happening was Allen met Carl Solomon, who was, and he was completely different from any of the people he'd ever met. Nobody was like Carl. And I mean, Carl got nailed one time for throwing potato salad at somebody. You know, he was he had his issues. I liked Carl very much, incidentally. He was a wonderful guy. Uh, but he was feeding new stuff into Allen, and so Allen's getting stuff from Carl Solomon over here and Jack Kerouac over there. William Burroughs was older than a whole group of them. He turned them on to all these writers that they'd never heard of before. It was all just you can't plan this stuff. It just happens.
So when was Howell published?
1956.
All right, but he wrote it
He
earlier.
read it, and he wrote because it was written in several sessions. The big session, the first part of Howell, was written uh, in 54, I believe. No, it was 55. Uh, and then the rest of it was written in 56, the Moloch section, and Carl, I mean, with you in Rockland, and then the footnote to Howell. And that was big immediately. There was no question. Alan read it for the first time out loud at the Six Gallery reading in San Francisco in 1956, or was it? Now I'm messing up the date. It's either 55 or six, and
Okay.
everybody who was anybody in literature just happened to be there that night. And they heard Alan goes up there. He's half loaded. He's been drinking all night. Kerouac refused to read. Kerouac, though, did not refuse to buy alcohol because that was his drug of choice. And Alan was half loaded, but his reading was sensational. You ought to hear these people. Michael McClure wrote a wonderful essay called Scratching the Beach Surface about that. Because that was a night that was, nobody had any idea that it would be what it was. Ferlinghetti sent Alan a letter the next day. Says, I greet you at the beginning of a great career. When do I see the manuscript? And those were almost identical words to what were written to Walt Whitman after he was reading. It, it's hard to explain tonight too. I should add this because you don't have the same emphasis on reading and writing that you used to have. I won my first prize as a writer when I was in fifth grade. Uh, you just, I never thought I would be anything other than that. And so that's what happened. Nowadays, people they've got blogs and they've got the stuff everywhere, and it's different. And I think that matters. I think I wonder whether or not Kerouac and Ginsberg, of course, would have. Ginsberg, because he loved all things. He couldn't run a computer to save his soul. He had to have somebody boot it up for him. But once it was on, he could type. And Kerouac was the speed demon of all time on a typewriter. I mean, he was way over everybody else. He was way over 100 words a minute. But would they have? That's hard to say whether or not they would have had uh, the same enthusiasm for it, because there isn't the enthusiasm for it there is now. Nowadays, to write a bestseller, you don't have to sell that many books. And I'm including the New York Times. It just because people don't read. And would these guys have done this at that time in the 40s, in the 50s? Who knows?
Well, I think they were fortunate in that they didn't have as many distractions. I mean, in the
No,
40s and 50s, most people didn't even have TVs. And then
right.
if you did, there was only a short period of time and a few channels to watch. So
Yeah, but
there wasn't,
the big year for television was 48.
yeah.
Yeah, so it was, yeah, because 48 is somebody should write a book about it. It ain't going to be me, but somebody ought to do it because 48 was an unbelievable year. Uh, that was the year that Hubert Humphrey gave his great speech on doing away with segregation of blacks. He gave it at the Democratic National Convention that Truman,
Mhm.
won. 48 was just such a phenomenal year. That was the year Ginsberg had his Blake visions. We haven't even talked about that yet. You know, he all of a sudden starts hearing the voice of William Blake reading to him.
Mm.
Uh, and of course he told everybody he knew about it, and everybody told him he was crazy. Except Joan Vollmer. Joan was the like one of the very few women that were part of that whole group. William Burroughs had two children by her, even though he was gay and she wasn't. Uh, she told Allen, "You hang on to those visions. There's nothing wrong with those visions." And when all these years later, all these years, mid 50s, Allen wrote this beautiful poem to Joan about that very thing, about remembering how important those Blake visions were. So,
Yeah.
it's everything.
Would you like to read a little bit from your book, from the introduction, maybe? Or
Well, I would have to get up for a second. Allow me to
sorry.
get up and
Sure.
no, it's right over here. I
Okay.
live in a very small place right now. It's a living room, a kitchenette, really, a bedroom and a bathroom. That's it. So everything and all my books. That was one of the rough parts about it was I had to get rid of books and CDs, two of my big passions in this life.
Yeah.
I must have given up 2,000 CDs, and I gave up at least 500 books this time because I had already gotten rid of the bulk of the books were given away uh, 10 years ago. So I got rid of over 10,000 books. So, and now I'm on a new writing gig, but let me get this book.
Okay. Go ahead.
Here it is. Dharma Lion. Now, you know what I love to read? I tell you, I've got certain things that I love to read from this book.
Okay.
But there was one when Alan was in India. He lived in India for a year and a half, and he he was always looking up religious figures, trying to figure out how to marry. What he learned and what he thought he learned in his Blake visions with what was going on in the real world. So he saw all these gurus and such. And it was really kind of fascinating. And there's this wonderful chapter, and it's short too, so I don't have to take much time. Uh, I'm right near it. Uh, but from Calcutta to Bangkok, oops, I must have left that. Um, okay, here we go. This is just it's very short, but it's one of my favorite scenes in the books, and I know for a fact it was one of Allen's. Whenever he could, Allen tried to ease the misery of the people that he saw. He could not bear to see the wasted bodies covered with feces and flies, the rheumy yellow eyes gazing into oblivion, of people left to die in the street, passed by citizens and tourists who pretended to think that such people did not exist. One day, Allen stopped by a naked man who lay motionless, curled in the fetal position, alive but obviously dying. He was nothing but bones, and flies lighted on open, festering wounds. There was a red teacup nearby, and Allen washed it out and offered the man a drink of fresh water. Then he brought him a plate of curry potatoes, which, as it turned out, the man was too weak to eat. Later, after washing his clothes in the Ganges, Allen returned to the scene where he saw that he found the man lying in the same place, now exposed to full sun. A young man sat nearby. Allen asked him what the older man needed or wanted, and was told that he wanted to be taken to water where it was cooler. Then, with the help of the young man, Allen and Allen's friend Peter carried the suffering man down to the river. They washed him, and afterwards Allen went for a doctor. In subsequent weeks, he and Peter hired the young man they met to wash him to see that he ate. They bought him a mattress. He grew stronger, and Allen eventually learned that the beggar had been tortured and had his tongue cut out by Muslims, and that he had a brother who lived halfway across the subcontinent. Allen saw that the brother was contacted. It happened that the beggar was missed by his family and had been given up for dead. And as the brother made his way across India to Benares, Allen approached hospital officials and, after some argument, managed to get the beggar admitted. By the time the brother arrived, the man's health had improved to such an extent that Allen was able to see them both leaving Benares by train. I love that. That is Allen Ginsberg. You want to know who Allen Ginsberg is? That's Allen Ginsberg. Now I'm going to tell you a story. I won't read it, but I'll tell it to you. Do I have time?
Yeah.
Kurt Vonnegut, another one of my favorite writers. Kurt Vonnegut, and I forget who the other writer was. I was with him. Another pretty well-known writer. We're going to Africa, where they were going to be part of a literary conference. And they're landing down in Africa on it's on bare ground and barely it just beat to hell. And boom, 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 the plane comes to a halt, and they get out. And all of these people that were waiting in this little building come running out after them, running toward them. And I should mention too, as I tell this story, this is a story that Vonnegut told the night he and Ginsberg together were drafted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I should mention this because this is just, it's so beautiful. He says, here these people come running out after him. And they were trying to figure out how the hell to get out of there. How are we going to do this? And Vonnegut looks at the other guy and he says, we shouldn't be doing this. These people just want to meet us. Because there were these kids, roomy eyes, and, they were shot. It looked like hell. And the other guy says, I'll tell you this. If Allen Ginsberg was here today, he'd be on the ground playing with those kids. That's how Allen is. And at that point in the award or in the ceremony to induct him into the thing, Vonnegut looks at Ginsberg and says, we've never met, but sir, such is your reputation. I love that story because that's just who Allen was. He was, I can't believe Allen's been dead forever. I knew him. I knew him well. I knew him first when I was writing the book, and then I became friends of his. And not anymore. As of last year, they sold his place, so they don't have the guest bedroom. I used to stay there, because Allen kept the guest bedroom for his mother, his stepmother, when she visited him. And if I ever got any point across about Allen, and there are many, There are many more books to come. I'm not going to be alive for most of them, but there are other books to come. And when they come, they're all going to be different. That's the funny thing about it. When Bill wanted to write a biography, and Bill Morgan was Allen's bibliographer, and this was no small thing. It took him 10 years working every day, Monday through Friday. And when Allen got rid of his stuff to Stanford University, there were over 1 million items. Bill was very busy, but Bill knew Allen as well as anybody alive, and he wanted to write a book about him. And he was afraid of how I would react to it. And I remember Peter Hale, who was handling Allen's office. Peter called to me and was telling me about it. And I said, I'll be the first guy to buy the book. What everybody's different. You're filtering them through your experiences. I'm a Wisconsin boy. Bill was from Chicago originally, but then he moved to New York. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different take. I'll be the first guy to buy his book. Don't you tell Bill not to worry about a thing. Besides, I don't know what grip do I have on Allen, other than I've done a bunch of his books. I've edited a bunch of them. I've written one, soon to be two. I'm good with it. You don't have to get real crazy with me. Let somebody else have it. But that's how. You know who told me the Vonnegut story, and I have it on paper because he gave me a copy. Was Kurt Vonnegut, because I wanted to meet Kurt Vonnegut, so I talked Writer's Digest. This is many, mucho years ago, and I went to Vonnegut's place. He lived He lived in New York City, and I went there and I spent an afternoon with him, and which wasn't enough time by a long shot. I could have spent a lifetime with him alone. That's the thing that's cool about where I'm at. As a biographer and so forth, I'm lucky. I'm getting to meet people and talk to, and I'm getting paid to do this. That's the beautiful part. I'm getting paid to do this. Joseph Heller, I met. All these people, Joyce Carol Oates, and all these people over the years, and people were paying me to talk to them. I was just getting a big charge. I got a room full of signed books. It was great. And again, Allen, I'm happy to do this again for you, incidentally. But as you can see, I divided the Allen book, Dharma Lion, I divided it into 3 parts because this is what I thought Allen was. The poet, that's part 1. Part 2 is prophet. And by prophet, I meant a guy who lived in his times, saw what was going on in his times, and thought what could happen as a result of these times. And that was Allen in the 60s. And then Allen, from that point on, was the teacher. He became a teacher. He taught for the rest of his life. I saw his books. I saw what he was recommending to people. So the only reason I mention all this is we could take any one of those and do 10 shows on it. That's the problem. He was a fascinating, unbelievable human being. And I was very blessed to know him and to work on stuff of his now. He's been gone. I do know, though, the 3 books of journals of his that I edited, he wanted to do all 3 of them. How do I know this? Because he told me. These are the books that I'd like to see out. There's still other ones that could come out. But, incidentally, I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't tell you about a wonderful piece of work that just came out. It's called Ginsberg Material. One second. I will show you the cover. Ginsberg, Material Wealth. And it was edited by Pat Thomas, who does mostly music, and Allen's secretary, I guess you'd call Peter. And what this book is, it is a collection of photographs. It probably won't even show up, but
Yeah, a little bit.
it's photographs, and it's writings, it's pieces of scrap. It's all this. Now it's not a cheap book. I don't remember what it was, but it was like $50 or something. But it's worth every penny. And this book, Pat is right now with Peter in Europe, where they are reading from the book there in England, last I heard. But it is a wonderful book. I was absolutely blown away by this book, and I've seen all of it. But you forget, and the reason I mention this is, and I know you're getting close to the end here, but the reason I mention this is that 10 people, and I said this in my review of the book, incidentally, 10 people could have been handed the job of put together a book of scraps about Allen Ginsberg that tell a reader who he was, and you would get 10 different books. There would be some repeats, but not many, because this thing just has it all. And I feel that way about Allen. He's been gone a long time. I was thinking about that, you know, because I've been asked. His 100th birthday will be in 2026, and I was asked to write something for that, and you can bet I'm going to. But Allen died in '97, and I was thinking about that in the 25th anniversary, and I'm going, "Whoa, this is he's been gone a long time." And but if these books keep coming out, and they do, there will always be something out there about him. He's so I can't tell you what a great guy he was. I I miss him. I miss him a lot.
Yeah. I did get a question in the chats
Sure.
earlier. They were curious what Alan was writing when he was in New York City in the early 60s.
In the early '60s, he wasn't in New
Hmm.
York. He was
Okay.
living in India and the Far East. Allen went through a period of travel. So did Kerouac, so did all of them, Burroughs, all of them. But Allen left New York and went to Europe, where he lived in what they call now the Beat Hotel. And then after that, he went back to New York, but only for a few months. And it split again, where he went to Africa, the Middle East, and then he went to India, where he stayed a long time. And then he went to Japan, where he met up with Gary Snyder again. And, you know, he was gone when Howell was tried for obscenity. Now, Allen wasn't charged, but, you know, the people selling the poem in front of Getty, um, he wasn't even here. They told him, "Don't bother, don't even bother." And so, it's some of the big things that happened, and this will come out in my book. I guarantee you it will, because he, Allen, wasn't here. Kerouac was, and Kerouac just was not the kind of guy that dealt with these people easily. He didn't deal with fame. He didn't deal with all this stuff. Allen loved it. Kerouac did not. And Allen was gone for that period. Now, he did when I wrote or I worked on his books, the Iron Curtain journals, for example. That was 65, and he was over there again. He was over there. He went down. He was asked to be a participant in a conference, and he was thrown out of Cuba for talking about, gay rights and free speech and everything else. Where was he thrown? They wouldn't take him back in our country, not straight from Cuba. He went to the closest country to Cuba, which was, that would be Czechoslovakia. So he went into Czechoslovakia, where he was thrown out of that country too, because he was seen as a bad influence. But where was he thrown? Swinging London, where he met the Beatles, where he met Bob Dylan, and so on and so forth. If you're looking at Dylan, you can look this up on YouTube. If you look up Dylan Subterranean Homesick Blues, that song, one of them was taken out of a movie that was made, and Allen is in the movie standing behind Dylan at the time talking. They became good friends. But and in fact, Bob Dylan and Allen went to Kerouac's gravesite, 75, I believe it was, to, during the Rolling Thunder Review tour. All this, it all snaps together. I take my word for it. It really does. Dylan is one of the first to admit books that he read that had great influence on him were Mexico City Blues, written by Jack Kerouac, and Howl by Allen Ginsberg. Those influenced him tremendously. And it was Dylan who found one of Ginsberg's early books, The Gates of Wrath, which were rhymed poems, a lot of them, written after Allen had his Blake visions. Dylan went to the trouble of buying them and then gave it back to him, the book. And then last but not least, Dylan gave Allen Ginsberg a gift in 65. It was a big reel-to-reel tape recorder. He said, Kerouac did it, only he wrote it. I want you to recite it. And Allen went on the road, and in that tape, and they all exist, the tapes to this day, they're very fragile. But he did some of his best writing. The stuff that came out of The Fall of America, for example, a lot of it came out of the tape recorder. I'm blowing the names of some of the works, the individual works, but he was fantastic. So everything factors in. Anybody that thinks that the 60s was a bunch of individuals is wrong. Period. I'm going to say that right now.
Okay, well, we're going to have you back another time because it looks like we have reached the end of our hour.
Fine.
But
you just let me know when. I'll look different because maybe I won't. Maybe I'll live the rest of my life without cutting my hair. I haven't decided yet. But no, it's always a pleasure talking about Allen. I can do it anytime, and obviously without notes. He's easy.
Oh.
But thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for coming and sharing all your stories with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And there are many more where that came from, believe me. You take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
You too.